This week we're using cheap materials to make our first farm building to go with the scatter terrain, and I'm getting inspiration from one of my new favourite games. With my farm tiles getting a lot of comments theming around Stardew Valley, I decided to give the game a go and very quickly became obsessed. Now to pick our first building, we're going to go talk to Robin and see what buildings she can construct for our farm. Let's go with the coop. So we're going to be taking the basic chicken coop from Stardew Valley and trying to build it in a slightly more fantasy style that will match with my world, but still hold this aesthetic. Using this image as my rough scale, I grabbed out a piece of thin MDF and started sketching out the rough layout and size that I wanted it to be. Quickly realizing if I wanted to be that same scale, I could just place the piece over top of my picture and sketch out the exact layout, so everything would match as close as possible to that original design. Changing up the depth of that original sketch shape that I laid out just a little bit by lining it up with our base pieces, I've now got the exact matching scale to our original design. Now to cut this out. I could use the table saw here, but a lot of people get mad when I use power tools. So here I'm showing that you can cut this just using a Stanley knife. It just takes a few long, slow cuts. Now we have our base piece, it's time to build up the walls. And for this, we're going to be using foam board. I'm just pulling a heap of measurements from that original base piece and the printout and cutting down some walls. Having this scale print is really helpful because I can kind of just place everything against it rather than getting perfect measurements, and honestly, even if I'm a little bit off, it's going to be good enough. So we have all of our walls. Now I just have to cut out that roof shape for the front and back piece, using the first one to match on the back. I was slightly off on my angle, but hey, it's going to do. Now I'm sketching out all those front details like the hatch and the door before coming in and cutting them out. We'll replace these later with our inserts, but for now I just want to really hack back that rough shape, giving us the core elements of the front. Next up, I start carving in the wood patterns, deciding in the middle of that to cut out the window because I kind of forgot, and then going back to carving out the rough shape of those wooden beams, then removing the door before coming in and cleaning up and deepening all of those rough patterns with, I use some random little piece of plastic before moving on to a pen. Since we want this to be a timber texture, I'm grabbing out a steel brush and pressing it against the foam and just scratching in a few more little textures and scrape lines, which will give us a nice base for a wooden texture later on. This wasn't quite working as well as I would have liked, so I grabbed out the scalpel and dug some nice deep cuts to carve out that classic, wooden grain texture. Because of the style of the artwork of this game, we can only see the front door. When we go inside this building, of course, we get that TARDIS effect where it's a way bigger building and it really just doesn't compute to how we could fill in the final walls, and you still don't see the side walls inside. So essentially for the side and back walls, I'm just gonna kind of have creative freedom and think about what I would actually want to place there. Firstly, we're gonna need another door on this side because it kind of just doesn't make sense to have the gated off area with the water and the hay for the animals to get to if they can't actually get access. So we'll put another little opening hatch on the side, maybe a window on the back, and we can just leave the final side bare, I think. So starting with that side piece, I'll cut in that extra hatch, and then I'll grab the back wall and add in another window up the top here. Now to stick it all together, we're going to be using some hot glue. And while that heats up, I'm going to grab out some chopsticks and cut these down to be sort of just some extra stabilization in the corners of the interior of this building, using a small hand saw. It's time to start sticking everything in place by just slopping down big chunks of glue and pressing them up against the edges of my wood. In this case, I've decided to lie them flat to the ground rather than placing them on top of the piece of wood because I want them to sort of sit more flat against whatever ground piece I put them on and not have an obvious lip or extra piece that's pushing them up off the ground. Once the walls are glued in, I start gluing in those support sections around the corners just to give them that little bit more stability and help as a guide for the other pieces. For now, I have left the front wall off because I want to just be able to move it a bit more freely when I add in some more details using coffee stir sticks. So I grab out some clippers and just start cutting a heap of these down to size to make some borders around our doors and windows. Just adding that little bit more something to separate them from the rest of the piece. All these little extra details aren't completely necessary, but they're the type of thing that I love adding onto a build. Now adding in a couple of little matchsticks to fill in that cross section of the window, giving us a good front facade. Now to match that same sort of style around the rest of our hatches and windows before moving on to building the actual wooden piece that will fit in that front hatch. For this, I'm just cutting down some more of those coffee stir sticks and building them out so they can slot in place. It's time to build out that yard area now, and for this I want a dirt base. So we're going to just cover it all in some PVA glue and spread this out so we're covering up all of this outdoor area. Once it's covered up nicely, we just start pouring a heap of gravel and dirt over it so it sticks down, giving us a nice earthy texture. And spritzing it with some isopropyl alcohol to really help it all soak in, giving it a few drops of watered down Mod Podge, and because I overdid this as I usually do, adding a little bit more dirt on top, letting that soak in and really dry to give us a nice solid textured outdoor base. I carved a door out of that same foam using the same techniques we did earlier to texture it up, making sure that it fit perfectly into that door slot on the front facade. I decided to raise the roof up a tiny bit to match the sides a little bit nicer, so I grabbed out some more of those chopsticks, measured them just by eye and cut them down to size. Once I had these pretty much how I wanted them, I just grabbed out that hot glue again and stuck them in place. This will give us a nice flat edge for the roof to stick down. Then obviously repeating this for the back so both sides are going to match. Now I'm pretty happy with our basic shape. It's time to seal everything up by mixing some matte Mod Podge, some black paint and a little bit of water just to water it down and cover our entire model. This will both harden up the external layer of the foam, but also protect it from spray paint so that when we give this thing a paint, it's not going to melt all that foam away, destroying all of our hard work. So we've got the rough shape of the actual building, now it's time to build out that fence. And for this we're going back to those coffee stir sticks, but I want them to look a little bit more rough, so we're going to just grab a knife and start hacking away at the edges, getting them a little bit more random, before starting to glue down our first layer, right butting up against the end of our MDF. Then adding in some fence posts that I cut from balsa wood. You could just use the chopsticks like earlier, but I had this balsa wood lying around so I decided to use it. Once we had those main posts in place, we can start building up our fence vertically by adding another cross post and then chopping down a whole heap of coffee stir sticks to match, but not before texturing them up as best we can. Well, now we have all that prepared, it's just time to start gluing these fence poles in place. At this point I decided to go with wood glue instead of the hot glue because hot glue just leaves a lot of mess and wood glue is, well, built for wood, so it seemed to make sense to me. With the fence done, we'll let that dry and start cutting out some scrap cardboard to make the base shape of our roof. These thin scrap cardboards are great for these kind of base elements we'll build up off of. We just want to make sure that it's cut to the right size that we want. So with a couple of dry fits and tweaks, we get that perfectly measured out. One thing I did realize is because I built the roof front and back facades up with those chopsticks, the side roofs didn't quite line up. So we cut down a couple more chopsticks and lined these up in place to make sure the roof was nice and flush along those walls. Quickly gluing these in place just so everything had a nice solid base for us to build off of. And while that dries, it's time to start cutting out tons of roof tiles. So we're going back to the scrap cardboard and just taking our time cutting down as many little bits of squares as we can and just starting to glue them in place on that roof element. Essentially we're just sticking a layer of them down and then running a layer that sort of overlaps, going further and further up, keeping them as random as possible. These kind of elements to a build take a lot of time and patience, so I highly recommend throwing on a podcast or something and just taking your time and zenning out while you glue this cardboard together. In my case, all the glue sort of soaked into the cardboard and warped it out of shape, so I just laid it down with some baking paper and something to hold it nice and flat and let it dry for the night. The next day, that's looking good. There was a little bit of runoff, I might have overdone the glue slightly, but it's good enough to glue it down. So once again, grabbing out the hot glue gun and just sticking it in place. Now we have our roof. We're missing one element. If we go back to that original image, we've got those curved tiles on the top. And for this, I'm going to be using paper straws. So essentially, I'm just grabbing out one of these little guys, cutting a line straight down the middle of it so we can open it up, and then cutting them into small sections. Bigger straws probably would have worked better for me, but this was all I could get. So one at a time, I started adding a little bit of hot glue and sticking them down, starting at the outside and working my way in, once again overlapping them kind of like we did with the shingles. Hot glue was probably a mistake here. While it dries quickly and made it easy to work with, it was super messy. And sometimes dried too quick, so if things didn't quite line up, I was just stuck with them. But hey, a bit of random jank is always fine on a build in my opinion. Now it's time to seal all this up to match. Even though the cardboard obviously won't melt with a spray paint, it's good to give everything the same base layer of color for painting later on. And like I mentioned earlier, it does just help to seal everything up and give it a really hard external layer. And now we need some more patience while we wait for that to dry. It's the next day, it's sunny outside, so this is a perfect opportunity to spray paint our model with a grey primer as a base, and then coming in with a Tamiya brown just to give everything a nice first layer, because essentially this is all wood and dirt and is going to have a brown undercoat for everything. While that paint job is looking pretty nice, it's too monotoned, so I'm going to grab a whole heap of different browns from my paint collection and add a bit more variety to our build. I'll be starting off with Tau Light Ochre. I'm coming in with a dry brush over basically everything with this because I just love the way that this color brings out the highlights and leaves a really nice matte finish, giving us that perfect look for a wooden board, especially when dry brushed over a darker color like we've got here. The dry brush really helps to bring out all those little bits of texture that we scraped into our foam at the beginning and brings the build kind of just to life, showing up more detail and allowing it to kind of have a bit more of a rough hewn look. I hit the roof, but I will be coming back and repainting that later. Now I'm grabbing out a slightly darker wood for our fence line so that it can have a little bit of variety. Then doing the same for the hatch and the front door, because once again we don't want it looking like everything's just made of the same wood. This helps to just give us a little bit more visual space. Now for that yard. While what we've got there is perfectly acceptable, I'm going to come in with a Tamiya Soil Effects brown and give it a coat as well. I just really like the way this stuff dries, and I can also now just paint that little bit extra, pushing its way into the coop like the dirt's been run through in and out as the animals come and go. Now to add a bit more variety, I'm grabbing out an Agrax Earthshade and I'm going to heavily coat the roof. As I mentioned, I'm going to be painting over this, so it's not really that important, but I thought I'd show you guys the process as, you know, we all change our mind as these builds go along often, and that's all part of the process. I also use this to add a bit more depth to the front door and hatches, and made a little bit more mess on the fence as well. Now it's time for a few little details with the hinges and that doorknob on the front door. For the doorknob, I'm grabbing out a tiny little glass bead from this collection, gluing it in place, and we'll come back and paint that up to match the right colors later. And then we want to do those hinges. For this, I've cut out two tiny little pieces of cardboard, stuck them in place, and I will paint these up silver. Then grabbing out a brass color for that handle. While we're working on details, I need a water bowl for that yard. So I'm grabbing out some polymer clay and just working it till I have roughly the right shape. And near enough is good enough. So we throw that in the oven for about 15 minutes to bake it rock hard. And while that's baking, I decided I don't love the roof. I want it to be brighter, so I'm giving it a super heavy coat in that Tau Light Ochre. And then once that dries, I'm coming in again with the Agrax Earthshade, making sure to wipe away all the excess and just let it really sit in those gaps, which just really helps show off all of that detail of the shingles. Seeing this footage now, I actually think I need to give that another layer coming up more from the bottom. So it's been about 15 minutes and our little polymer bowl is ready to paint. I'm hitting this at first with a red terracotta paint that I really like, but it's kind of just a bit too bright. So I mix up a bit of a lighter leather brown with the red terracotta to try and give myself a color that I like. This might not match exactly what's in the game art, but hey, I'm working with what I got and it's my build, so I can make it however I like. Now to add some water into our water bowl, I'm going to mix up a little bit of this 2-to-1 clear epoxy. I overdid it with the ink just a little bit. It was way too dark, so I actually ended up tipping this out and redoing it, but forgot to film that. And this stuff takes about 24 hours to cure, so we'll come back tomorrow to finish off this build. That's had time to cure. Now we just want the top to be a little less perfect. So I'm grabbing out some gloss Mod Podge and just blotching this on, making sure to push it around and make it look bumpy and ripply so that when this dries nice and clear, it leaves us with that bumpy, rippled texture of water. Now that dries, let's prepare the rest of the yard. I've made a slightly different hatch to go over the top of this entry on the side. It's just made with the same foam and stir sticks method as before, painted up the same as the rest of the building. But to hold it up, I'm going to grab another matchstick and stain it up with some Agrax Earthshade. Before gluing that down, however, we really want to focus on that straw. And for this, I'm going to be using coconut fiber. You can pick this up from garden shops, or in our case, we got it from a pet shop to be used as nesting material for our pet birds. I'm chopping this up so much finer than the original size because obviously to scale, the original size just really didn't make sense. But once we're left with a good patch, I'm going to grab out some glue, mix in some soil effects. Probably don't need the soil effects because this is going to dry clear, but I just want to make sure we got that nice matte soil texture, and douse this entire yard section in that glue and texture paste mix. Once everything's covered nice and thick, I'm just going to start spreading out all this chopped down coconut fiber and pressing it down in place. And we'll be sealing that up shortly as well. But first, I'm grabbing that stick out again that we had earlier, chopping it down to size, and gluing our hutch open so whatever we keep in this coop can get out to this outdoor free range area. And now we're going to seal that all up so that that coconut fiber doesn't make a mess everywhere by spritzing it with isopropyl alcohol and then giving it a heavy douse in a 50-50 mix of matte Mod Podge and water. Once this is dry, the whole thing should be basically rock solid and stay nice and firm throughout gameplay. So we've got the building done, we've got our nice little water bowl. I think we're just missing something. We need some chickens. So I jumped onto Thingiverse, found some free chicken models, I'll have them linked in the description, printed these out on my resin printer, gave them a wash, a cure, a quick prime with some grey primer, a blast with some Wraithbone white, and then painted them up with some speed paints and contrast paints to give us a nice range of feathered friends to fill in the coop. And with that, I can now take my original reference and say that I have built the chicken coop from Stardew Valley. It's not perfect, but I'm pretty happy with it. Some of the materials weren't perfect, but it works great for that old barn effect, and that coconut fiber looks great for straw in the yard, so it's probably going to get used again in the future. And I thought, why not throw a little rooster on the roof? Combining this with all of my scatter farm tiles and the fruit trees, I've got the start of a really cool farm board, but I think I'm going to need a few more Stardew inspired buildings to fill out the farm. Now, while I'm stoked with my chicken coop, there are things I wish I'd done differently in hindsight and a few mistakes that were made. So today we're going to be trying a new segment in this episode called Mistakes Were Made. So every build has things we don't love, and in this one I kind of stuffed up on the top here. Somehow I've peeled a whole heap of paint off when sealing it up. Also, there's a lot of hot glue and remnant glue that's poking out. I really should have taken my time and been a little bit more careful with that. The other thing that was really a major mistake that I think I made was I tried to come in at one point with a lighter and clean up some of the wisps of hot glue, and I melted away at the foam. Always be careful with heat with foam, it will just destroy it. But once again, old building, and that was on the back, so not too big of a deal. Let's talk scale. This building is huge for 28mm scale. These chickens are living better than most villages. So considering the scale of it and everything that we need, I might make another chicken coop in the future that is much smaller and use this one as a pig pen or something else. This just gives me more range to put down on the table, and honestly, I could make something much smaller to work as a chicken coop and serve the same purpose without taking up so much floor space on our battle mat. There is one more thing I really wish I had done better in hindsight. I wish that I'd made the roof removable. This way I could have had access to the inside of the building and actually made the inside playable down the line if I wanted to. The other bonus would be that I could have gotten in here and put some plastics behind the windows, giving us that idea that there's actually glass in there. For now, just the black insides are fine, but I really would have loved to be able to fill that in, and like I said, maybe one day build out the inside of this and make it playable. I'm sure there's a lot of other things I will realize as I go on that I could have done better, but for a quick, easy build, this is absolutely going to serve its purpose, being the first building on our farm table, and hopefully only the first of many to come. We still need a barn, a farmhouse, maybe a silo and a greenhouse, a stable. Honestly, the list is endless of the large variety of buildings we could be making for our farm board. So let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see me make next to build out our farm, whether it's from Stardew Valley, some other game, or just something cool you'd like to see in the farm build, because I'm really liking this idea of taking more pop culture and game related designs and building them into something physical for my table. I hope you guys have had fun with this one and learned something that you can apply to your own board. Otherwise, I hope you've just had fun following along my nerdy crafts. And remember, until next time, never stop making stuff. And go watch this other video of mine that YouTube thinks you'll like.